Vamos a ir comenzando. Sé que hoy tenemos un poco más de lío por la traducción. Los aparatos, sí. Indicaciones. Primero, para que funcione el aparato, tiene que estar conectado el casco, ¿vale? Porque si no, le vais a dar al botón y no va a funcionar. Entonces, primero hay que conectar el casco. Le dais a un botón de encendido, que es un botón plateado que está en la parte frontal. Y, en principio, parece que es el número 1, ¿vale? Y si oís en el 2, pues será el 2. Pero en principio es el número 1, me han dicho. La conferencia, como decimos, es en inglés. Bueno, obviamente, si alguien conoce el idioma, pues no necesita el aparato. ¿Qué pasó? ¿Perdón? Sale 0, pero si le van dando a la derecha, va subiendo. ¿Sí? ¿Me están oyendo a mí? Pues escucharán a la intérprete en cuanto Alexandra empiece a hablar en inglés. ¿Me oyen? ¿Me oyen? Bueno, es un poquito de lío. Por cierto, una cuestión práctica. El casco no hace falta devolverlo después. Es desechable. Bueno, lo pueden seguir utilizando, pero no se devuelve al museo. Solamente cuando salgan devuelven a la entrada el aparatito que tienen, el de la traducción. Bueno, pues vamos allá. Yo creo que ya más o menos, si hay cualquier duda, por supuesto, nos pueden preguntar en cualquier momento. Gracias por estar aquí un día más. Hoy es ya la cuarta de las conferencias de este ciclo de mujeres artistas en el siglo XIX, mujeres artistas en el Prado, el siglo XIX y el tránsito a la modernidad. Las primeras dos conferencias fueron de contexto. La semana pasada vimos a las románticas y a Teresa Nicolau Parodi. Y hoy seguimos profundizando en autoras concretas. Como sabéis, el resto de conferencias que quedan van a ser como de autoras individuales. Vamos a abordar, nuestra ponente invitada nos va a hablar de una pintora desconocida hasta ahora, sobre todo desconocida en su nombre original. Era alguien que firmaba como Jacques François en las exposiciones del grupo impresionista, pero no sabíamos que detrás de esa identidad había una mujer. La relación que tiene esta artista con el Museo del Prado, que también sabéis que todas las que están participando, todas las artistas de las que hablamos en este ciclo, tienen algún vínculo con el Museo del Prado, es porque contamos aquí con un retrato de ella realizado por Federico de Madrazo en el tiempo en el que ella estaba en Madrid y venía a hacer copias al Prado. Hemos invitado a la investigadora que ha descubierto esto y que ha puesto en el centro del debate a esta figura al descubrir que si hasta ahora pensábamos o sabíamos que había 4 mujeres en el grupo impresionista, ahora ya sabemos y ella está demostrando y además nos va a explicar en qué se ha basado para llegar a esta conclusión. Por cierto, que también me contaba que nos va a decir cosas completamente nuevas que ni siquiera ha escrito ni publicado todavía. Pero lo más interesante, lo que cambia la historia, es que podemos empezar a hablar de 5 impresionistas, 5 mujeres impresionistas en aquellas exposiciones que empezaron a celebrarse en el año 1874. Alexandra Morrison es investigadora y comisaria. Actualmente es asistente de comisariado en el Departamento de Pintura y Escultura del Museo de Arte Moderno de Nueva York, el MoMA. Realizó su tesis sobre la copia en el Museo del Louvre y por ella fue galardonada con el Premio Porter de la Universidad de Yale, donde se doctoró en el año 2019. Anteriormente ocupó puestos de prácticas curatoriales, becas y pasantías en diferentes museos de Francia y Estados Unidos. Por ejemplo, el d'Orsay de París o la Galería Nacional de Arte de Washington. Especialmente interesante también para el tema que nos ocupa, el de las mujeres artistas, es su estancia en el Château de Rosabonnais, el castillo que fue vivienda del artista y que hoy es el museo de la pintora francesa. Autora de esa cabeza de león que ya hemos mencionado varias veces en este ciclo y que cada vez que la nombramos o que aparece en pantalla el Cid, se produce un murmullo entre el público que yo interpreto como de reconocimiento. Entre las investigaciones de Alexandra Morrison está la razón, entonces, por la que la hemos invitado a venir, y es que está desarrollando todas estas investigaciones sobre esta pintora cuyo descubrimiento no solamente cambia la historia del arte de la segunda mitad del siglo XIX, sino que deja sobre la mesa una pista o nos recuerda todo lo que queda por hacer, todas las posibles mujeres que pueda haber escondidas detrás de alias y seudónimos masculinos. Gracias, Alexandra, por tu trabajo, por venir desde tan lejos. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming, and you are very welcome.
Thank you. Hanging a short distance from here, in Gallery 62A, to be precise, is this portrait. Okay. I feel I should take this opportunity to say how sad I am. I could not present en español. Apologies. Lo siento. I'm really so pleased to be here tonight to talk about this figure and to share with you her work and to show you for the very first time some of her painting that's never been published before and never seen. If all technical difficulties have been overcome, we will restart. Hanging a short distance from here, in Gallery 62A, to be precise, is this portrait. It is painted by the artist and two-time director of the Prado, Federico de Madrazo. The subject is a young woman who sits in profile. Her face is exquisitely rendered by Madrazo, whereas the rest of her body diffuses across the surface of the canvas. A suggestion of her right hand remains. It is simultaneously raised and lowered with an instrument balanced between her fingers. The effect is one of a hand in motion, moving in a controlled stroke. She is wielding a paintbrush. Madrazo introduces here an innocent sleight of hand. Thus positioned, she appears to be painting the canvas itself. And who is she? Madrazo has answered this question for us. Inscribed in the lower left, we see a name, La Marquesa de Rambures, or Rambures. This name is likely unfamiliar. You would not find a single painting or drawing with her signature in a museum in Spain or France. Nor would you find any mention of her name in connection to the Parisian Salon, one of the preeminent stages for exhibition in 19th century Europe. But she has long been hiding in plain sight. Louise Amour Marie de la Roche de Fontigny, the Marquise de Rambures, was in fact one of only 5 women to participate in the Impressionist shows that took place in Paris between 1874 and 1886. In what follows, I aim to offer a portrait of this artist that is even more complete than Madrazo's. First, I will show how she remained in obscurity for 150 years. Then, I will situate her and her work at the 3 Impressionist exhibitions in which she participated. The second in 1876, the third in 1877, and the 8th and last in 1886. We will end back here at the beginning by re-examining her artistic formation between Paris and Madrid. Though long overlooked, this was in part by her own design and her decision to use a male pseudonym, Jacques François. For one, the artist hailed from a noble family who had left a mark on French history long before the rise of Impressionism. A short biography of her ancestry, as recorded in the genealogies of aristocratic families, would go something like this. Her great-grandfather, the Marquis François Claude de Bouillé, famously rallied royalists to protect King Louis XVI's flight from France at the onset of the French Revolution. This mission was, needless to say, unsuccessful. Before defending the ill-fated monarch, he had governed Guadeloupe, Martinique, and St. Lucia. The Marquis de Bouillé had 3 children. His youngest son, François Guillaume Antoine, at the far right, returned to the Caribbean by the close of the 18th century. In 1800, on Guadeloupe, he welcomed a son, Jules François Amour de Bouillé, the artist's father. His first 2 names, it would appear, inspired her pseudonym. The artist was born in Petit-Bourg, one of Guadeloupe's main ports, in 1844. Her mother's family, the de Bonneuil, had been based in this region of the island for generations and grew sugar. The artist's birthplace in the Caribbean and European lineage made her Creole, according to 19th century French definition. When her family moved to Paris in 1849, therefore, she did not arrive as une Française. For the rest of her life, she would self-identify as Creole, putting her in the unusual position of being simultaneously a privileged member of French society and an outlier. In 1864, at the age of 20, she married Charles Antoine de la Roche de Fontenay, the heir to the title of Marquis de Rambure. Between 1870 and 73, the young couple lived here, in Madrid. Her husband held a diplomatic post at the French embassy. This role was undoubtedly arranged by her father's first cousin, Amour Louis Charles René, who had inherited the title of Marquis de Bouillé. He was a witness to their marriage in 1864 and served as the French ambassador to Spain between 1871 and 1874. When the couple returned to France, they lived mainly between Paris and Picardy. They had no children. She died in 1924, her husband in 1930. This storied aristocracy to which the artist belonged was even more conservative than the French bourgeoisie. For women artists, as counterintuitive as it may seem, the more privileged one's background, the more challenges lay in the path of an artistic career. Other women in the Impressionist circle, like Berthe Morisot, who you see at the left, or Marie Cassatt, who you see at the right, faced obstacles to access education and models. The subjects of their paintings, such as interiors and motherhood, thematized these constraints. But they were not required to resort to subterfuge to show their work. This difference in class explains why the Marquise de Rambure became Jacques François at her debut with the Impressionists at their second ever exhibition in 1876. Other women of her rank had done the same. Take, for example, the Swiss sculptor and painter Adèle Daffry, who used the name Marcello. Descended from Swiss nobility, Daffry became a duchess through marriage at the age of 20. 5 years later, she submitted an application to the École des Beaux-Arts. She was rejected. Well-connected, however, she pursued an education regardless and later exhibited in Paris and throughout Europe, but always under the protection of a male pseudonym. As you can see from the photograph at the left, Marcello's true identity eventually became an open secret. The Marquise's identity was so well concealed, however, that it remained so for 150 years. Some scholars must have thought further inquiry was unwarranted, as Jacques François appeared only in the catalogs of the second and third Impressionist shows, and her output had amounted mostly to still lifes. And, to the best of anyone's knowledge, none of her art had survived. Perhaps for this reason, above all, no one ever made a serious attempt to discover her identity. This would have been an essential step in reinstating her among the ranks of the far more numerous men whose paintings, letters, and notebooks conveniently fill museums, archives, and libraries. Some may have even thought she did not deserve such attention. While she had received good reviews, more attention had been devoted to her peers. And so the question of Jacques François was forgotten or dismissed as an unsolvable riddle, except that it wasn't. A letter, a notebook page, a review, and the Salon of 1873. These 4 pieces of evidence have long been known to scholars, and in late 2019, about a decade after first learning Jacques François existed, I connected them and identified the Marquise de Ramburg as Jacques François. The first was penned by Gustave Caillebotte in 1881 and addressed to his fellow impressionist, Camille Pissarro. In this angry letter, containing no less than 11 exclamation points, Caillebotte railed against Edgar Degas. According to Caillebotte, Degas cared more about his place in society than he did painting. He picked fights with other talented painters like Monet and Renoir. And lastly, he invited undesirables to the group. Degas had invited Caillebotte in 1876, but that was a most inconvenient point. Who did he bring us? Caillebotte seethed. In 1876, Le Pic and Le Gros and Madame de Ramburg. In 1877, Moreau and again Madame de Ramburg. Caillebotte was unfairly selective in his rage, but his memory was accurate. At the time of his address, Madame de Ramburg had appeared at the 2nd and 3rd Impressionist shows only, but a single painter had the same attendance record, Jacques François. A notebook page draws a clear line between this Madame de Ramburg and the painter of ballerinas, jockeys, and bathers. Like any traditionally trained artist, Degas kept his pocket-sized notebook on him throughout most of his life. Dozens of them survive. They are filled with attentive drawings after old masters, caricatures, and reminders to himself. One notebook, dating to the end of the 1870s, contains in its last pages the following annotation in Degas' hand. Madame de Bouillé for Madame de Ramburg, 69 Avenue Josephine. The short note confirms not only that Degas knew a Madame de Ramburg and a Madame de Bouillé, but also so well that he even had their address. Third, the review. The champion of the Neo-Impressionists, art critic Félix Fénéon, mentioned a Comtesse de Ramburg in his review of the last Impressionist exhibition held in 1886. Fénéon's mention of her presence was brief and tongue-in-cheek. His remark suggested that her absence from the catalogue had been deliberate. But this bears context. 1886 was the year Neo-Impressionism took center stage. If she had presented still lifes next to Georges Seurat's mammoth canvases and never-before-seen dots, her work may have indeed appeared especially conventional. The last piece of evidence predates even the first Impressionist exhibition of 1874. In Paris, at the Salon of 1873, an artist named Jacques François presented a still life entitled Fruits and Flowers. The catalogue provided a biographical byline, born in Guadeloupe. These 4 documents identify the Marquise de Ramburg as Jacques François and sketch the contradictory outline of her artistic persona. A Creole aristocrat descended from French nobility, a woman artist among avant-gardes, a painter invited by Edgar Degas, who is often called a misogynist, a participant at the traditional salon, but also 3 of the 8 Impressionist exhibitions. How do we reconcile her true identity with Impressionism? And most importantly, what of her art? In 1874, an exhibition of paintings and works on paper opened in Paris. A group of artists, a so-called Société Anonyme, had banded together to organize the independent show. Few in the French metropole had ever dared to do so. Initial reviews had been mixed, but then an art critic named Louis Lecroix came along and baptized them Les Impressionnistes, in this very review, in fact. The epithet was not bestowed to erase the original sin that had been on display, an assortment of apparently unfinished, garish, colorful little pictures of places and people, both provincial and urban. But the name stuck. Against the Paris art machine, the Impressionists had started an insurrection for creative autonomy. At stake was independence, both organizational and aesthetic. History has remembered mostly the latter, a desire to capture light's fleeting effects and to depict modernity with the gestural handling previously reserved for sketches and studies only. But as is the case with most paradigm shifts, few critics at the time appreciated the merits of their experiments, and even fewer believed in the longevity of either. The second exhibition that took place 2 years later, in April 1876, was therefore a critical moment. Roughly half of the original participants had not returned, leaving openings in their ranks. Dancers at rehearsal, the Seine banks in nearby Argenteuil, as well as friends, family, and patrons reading, promenading, sitting, posing, and laboring, scattered across roughly 250 works. Many of these have become icons of Impressionism. Degas' Dance Rehearsal, Monet's Argenteuil, and Caillebott's Floor Scrapers, which I'm showing you here to scale, are just a few examples. It was in this context that the Marquise de Rambures, as Jacques François, made her Impressionist debut and became one of the first women to participate in the groundbreaking experiment. She presented 8 works: a portrait, which you see as number 76, Portrait of Madame N, a landscape, number 75, Estamo de Tabaco a la Alhambra, which I'll just say here, I realize is not a true Spanish title, and 6 still lifes of flowers, grapes, and pomegranates. The dessert, number 77, drew particular commendation. Reviews place her 8 submissions that year in the vicinity of Degas' 24 paintings and pastels, which included Dance Rehearsal and a cotton office in New Orleans, as well as various laundresses and milliners. At the third Impressionist exhibition of 1877, Rambures shared 2 works entitled At Vespers and Portrait of Madame B. Having sent only these 2 submissions to the third show, she attracted less notice in 1877. These works likely hung near paintings by Caillebott and Renoir, including the latter's The Ball at the Moulin de la Galette. Next to these compositions, her talents for color and handling clashed with the far more radical experiments of her peers and kept her work within the visual realm of the official salon. Why did the Impressionists admit amongst their ranks men with whom they have nothing in common? Wondered one critic in late April 1877, calling attention to the group's lack of a unified aesthetic program. It was perhaps this kind of review that remained in Caillebott's mind when he wrote to Pissarro 4 years later. At the last Impressionist show in 1886, the catalogue omitted Jacques François, and only Fénéon mentioned her presence at the finale. Based on the description and reception of her work in the previous shows, we may speculate that she produced works in her preferred genres, portraits and still lifes. Another review noted the work of a Monsieur François, a painting of a woman in blue. Scholars have suggested the author meant to refer to Jean-Louis Forain, but it could very well have been in reference to Jacques François. None of these works have yet been located, unfortunately, but their titles clearly point to the genres most available to women artists: the humble and inescapably domestic still life, the landscape that could be studied discreetly during travels, and the portrait for which friends and family might be recruited. In light of Cambuel's biography and identification, other precisions come into focus. The Alhambra landscape from 1876 most likely dated to her sojourn in Spain in the early 1870s. Not being a native speaker of the language, Cambuel would have then conferred upon the work its odd, not quite Spanish title. Her standout still life, The Desert, was probably a larger painting, given the remarks made about it by several critics. Featured in 1877, Cambuel's religious At Vespers, an exception to the overwhelmingly secular Impressionist canon, was most likely inspired by her own devout Catholic faith. One of the few credits in her true name is editor of a text advocating the end of scientific vivisection entitled The Church and Pity Towards Animals, published in 1899 with the support of Catholic allies. The portrait she painted that year may have featured her mother as its sitter. This seems particularly likely given the appearance of both their names in Degas' notebook from the same period. The reviews from 1876 and 1877 also demonstrate how she occupied a paradoxical position in the group. As you can see from this chart, published by historian John Rewald in the History of Impressionism in 1946, the exhibitions attracted many participants over the years. This roster encompassed artists from many different backgrounds and a range of artistic styles. Women, highlighted here in red, were few. I'm showing you here 4 of the 5 women whom Rewald included: Marie Braquemond, Mary Cassatt, Jacques François, and Berthe Morisot. He omitted the 5th, the Comtesse de Luchaire, who appeared only at the first Impressionist exhibition. On one hand, thanks to her invented moniker, Cambuel sidestepped the particular brand of criticism reserved for other women artists. Most reviewers recognized that Jacques François was an alias, but few inferred that it disguised a woman. Only Philippe Berti, writing for the Academy's readership in London, hinted to both the gender and status of the individual. He described her as, quote, a woman of society. Even by the opening of the Third Impressionist show, however, some remained ignorant of the fact that Morisot was not the only woman whose work was present. In one report, Morisot was called, the, quote, the sole representative of her sex, a declaration unsurprisingly followed by criticism. The same reviewer praised Monsieur Jacques François, undoubtedly a pseudonym, who shows much finesse and brightness. Overwhelmingly, Cambuel drew recommendation for her talent. Her praise was not saddled with the framings of wife, woman, feminine painter, with which Morisot and later Marie Braquemond and Mary Cassatt had to contend. A cue to signal that the artist's ability, even any glimmering of talent, had most likely already been irreparably dampened by a stunted education. Her respectable appraisal was not due simply to her adopted gender, however. Although Impressionism is often presented as a cohesive movement, there were other members of the group who did not paint en plein air or use the loose brushwork we associate today so much with Monet and Renoir. 55 artists participated at the 8 exhibitions. Many of the names on this list remain as overlooked as Jacques François. Armand Guillaumin, Ernest Rouart, and Charles Tillot, for example, each participated more than 6 times. Monet participated 5 times, Renoir only 4. These 2 works I'm showing you now act as useful poles for the spectrum of different approaches to modernism that Impressionism actually encompassed. Monet's impression Sunrise, which inspired Le Croix's name for the group in 1874, is at the left. At the right is Georges Seurat's mammoth, divisionist, pointillist magnum opus, Sunday at La Grande Jatte, shown in 1886. The reality is that what unified the group of 55 artists was their collective action in these independent undertakings. In this framework, Rambure's work emerges as a useful middle ground. One critic described her as center-left. Although she was thus pegged as a moderate among the Impressionists, the reviews that described her painting in depth point to a nevertheless experimental hand. Critic Jacques Rivière offered the following praise. Monsieur Jacques François, a lady, I think, exhibited a remarkable still life with grapes, pastries, a box of figs, etc. It's a master's work without precedent. Never before has such a still life with such spirit and such facture been seen. It's an extraordinary work that opens new possibilities for the still life. We cannot repeat it enough. The likes of it have never been seen before. The facture is wide and varied, very ingenious. Monsieur Jacques François has given us a result from which other artists will most certainly benefit. Regrettably, the dessert is among the works that have not yet been found. But Rivière's description could apply to another painting that does still remain. Fruits and Flowers, the artist's submission to the Salon in 1873. From the lower left corner, a dog looks up to a heavily laden table. A folded apron or tablecloth is pinned below a tower of copper and pewter pots that support stacks of pears, apples, peaches, and grapes. Flowers and foliage fall between these towers of fruit. The background is an earthy, greenish-gray, and thinly painted. It contrasts with the rosy peaches and glistening copper that rest on the table. The frame still bears, at the very top, 589, its number in the Salon exhibition catalog. Roughly 2 meters tall, the painting is of unusual proportions for the genre. In subject, scale, and style, Fruits and Flowers is also very distinct from what we now associate with Impressionism. Although many Impressionists did paint still lifes, the artists rarely included them in the early Impressionist shows. In 1876, the only other notable still life came in the form of a decorative panel from Monet. Since the inception of the French Academy, genres had been ranked. A history painting was most prestigious, the still life the least. The reason for this was the still life's lack of the human figure. Women artists, however, had the most access to this genre. It did not require a live model. It could also be executed over time if maternal or other domestic responsibilities interrupted painting. In terms of scale, most works at the Impressionist shows tended to be of a more intimate size. Compare, for example, Degas' Dance Rehearsal or Renoir's Nude, again, both shown here to scale. The scale of Fruits and Flowers is suited for the official salon, a place for one's work to be seen and reputations forged. The salon was not typically the venue in which to offer works for purchase. Impressionists were also trying to change this. Most works shown at their exhibitions were of a modest scale so that visitors might be induced to buy. A large work was simply more difficult to sell. A private collector would need ample room to display it, and even the wealthiest did not necessarily have halls like the Louvre's Grande Galerie to fill. In handling and color, the Marquise's still life uses many different kinds of touch and an earthy palette, one that stands in complete contrast to the likes of Renoir's Nude or one of Monet's paintings on view in 1876, Argenteuil. Of the entire group, Monet is the Impressionist par excellence. He painted outdoors, on the scale for the market, and using the vivid paints that had been developed and mass-produced just a few decades before. Rambure, in contrast, was working firmly indoors and in a palette closer to that of the old masters. Ironically, it is perhaps Caillebotte's work with which Rambure's Impressionist production has the most in common. Both relish in the play of light and shadow, as well as a scale that commands attention, whether in the crowded salon or a dealer's brimming showroom. Both artists enjoyed a position of social privilege and financial independence. Neither was particularly intent on selling their art, giving them flexibility to explore and develop compositions in any dimension they chose. Caillebotte's work, however, was deeply tied to the rapidly changing Parisian landscape. To what then was her painting the most connected? Little is known about her earliest artistic training, I'm afraid. In France, aristocratic ladies and well-to-do bourgeoises often had basic lessons in drawing, watercolor, and painting. So it is likely that Rambourg began making art under the instruction of a tutor in Paris during her teenage years. Thanks to the Louvre and the Prado, we may know more about her artistic activities in the years leading up to the Impressionist exhibitions. Following her marriage in 1864, Rambourg registered at the Louvre as a copyist. This practice was ubiquitous, a rite of passage for every artist in Paris in the 19th century. About a third of copyists were women. While a few teachers opened studios to women artists in Paris, a young artist had far fewer options if she was a mademoiselle rather than a monsieur. The museum's equality was a happy accident of the French Revolution. The Louvre had opened its doors the very week that the Royal Academy was dissolved in 1793 and served as a replacement to the system. The new museum's mission to democratize the arts included copying as a key pedagogical exercise. As first pictured by Hubert Robert in 1796, this practice was consistently protected through many changes in administrative regime and had always invited all artists, regardless of gender. Throughout the late 1860s, Rambourg held a permission, the designation for copyists who were hobbyists or foreigners. This was the de facto category for many women who were considered amateurs if they were not part of a master studio. Artists who had presented at the salon earned the status artiste. Students of established teachers had the designation élève. At the right, you can see a laissez-passer dating to 1873, which belonged to the artist Achille Empereur. He was recommended by his teacher, Thomas Couture. Rambourg's fellow impressionist, Berthe Morisot, followed almost this exact trajectory. Like Morisot, Rambourg registered to copy at the museum in the late 1860s and received a permission. But unlike her counterpart, who named Guichard as her teacher upon registering, which you see here at the right, Rambourg identified no one. Jean-Baptiste Oudry, Paolo Veronese, and Titian were her adopted masters in the Louvre's Grande Galerie. In copying them, Rambourg studied the human figure and the still life, training for the genres she later exhibited at Jacques François. It was around this time that another unusual exhibition opened in Paris. In 1860, visitors rediscovered many examples of 17th and 18th century French painting, including many compositions by the still life painter Chaldin. At the time, the Louvre usually displayed only two paintings by this artist, the Ray, which you see at the left, and the Buffet at the right, his Morceau de Réception that secured his induction to the French Academy. The works on view came from private collections, and the exhibition was a revelation to many. Although we may only speculate as to whether Rambourg visited, it seems all too likely that she did attend. The catalogue was penned by Philippe Berthier, the same writer who called Jacques François a lady of society. Some years later, she arrived with her husband to Madrid. Having copied at the Louvre, Rambourg was therefore already an experienced, able painter. Likely through the embassy's social circle, she met the director of the Prado, Antonio Gisbert. It is he who personally recommended her as a copyist at the museum in 1871. The Prado's records do not record which artworks she studied between 1871 and 73, but her copy after the Prado's Mother and Child by Rubens does still survive. Her version is a particularly vivid scene that exaggerates the original lighting and touch. The holy duo at center appears dramatically illuminated, and the painter's brush simplifies details like the frill of a cuff to an abstract dash of paint. Already here, one sees the beginning of the facture that Rivière praised just a few short years later. What else may have caught her attention here at the Prado? It is easy to imagine Rambures also transfixed by the many still life paintings that fill the galleries here, such as Melendez's Grapes, given their repeated inclusion in her still life paintings, Fruits and Flowers from 1873, and The Dessert from 1876, based on Rivière's description. It is possible that she also practiced for this genre through the Prado's collections. Here at the museum, if not in the same society through which she met Gisbert, Rambures met Federico de Madrazo. Like Rambures, the Spanish painter moved frequently between art worlds. He had studied and exhibited in Paris and was Gisbert's predecessor at the helm of the Prado. In her later years, she reminisced about her time in the galleries here and marveled at the skill of Monsieur F., who treated his subjects with assiduous attention as he rendered them. Her portrait is no exception. Its personal scale and finish suggests that Madrazo may have completed it in a single sitting, perhaps next to the Marquise as she copied at an easel in the galleries. For an apparently self-trained artist, nothing would be more fitting than a portrait painted as she copied and practiced her brush. In the years preceding Impressionism's spark, her painting was then very much tied to tradition and to two important museums in two different metropoles, Paris and Madrid. In this context, if we return to Flowers and Fruits, her composition emerges as one engaged with both French and Spanish painting. Monumental in size, and, I would point out, exhibited in a distinctly Spanish frame, her painting is a forceful declaration of her artistic identity and gestures to the masters whose works offered a curriculum, Chardin and Melendez above all. Does it also offer an inconspicuous link to her portrait by Madrazo? The distinctive gray-green background of the still life recalls that of the small work that remains in the galleries here. Whether intended or accidental, an affinity connects these two works made by artists whose friendship was forged here in the galleries. This presentation began with Madrazo's portrait. I would like to conclude it now with these two photographs. A lady is at the center of these two images, a protagonist surrounded by other figures, including a young girl. Juxtaposed side by side, the two photographs are a play of dress up and pose. Who are these women and where have we found them? Various clues abound. In the background of the photograph at the right, a humble still life painting of a jug and a bowl of fruit hangs on the wall. The very picture it depicts sits on a table below. Many other canvases adorn the wall between them, forming a constellation of compositions. This is a space where things and people are posed and pictured, an artist studio. Now, look further up the wall. Up high is another painting, much larger. While cropped by the camera in both of these photographs, two figures are distinguishable by their pleated skirts. It is a detail of a painting that should be familiar to all of you. Velázquez's Las Meninas. Dating to about 1900, these two images are self-portraits staged by Rambure in her studio. The images are both intimate and enigmatic, much like the woman behind Jacques François. They are also compositions that play with contradiction, a fitting parallel to her position in Impressionism. She complicates its history, reminding us how the works presented at these exhibitions was heterogeneous and varied, and how artists from all ranks of society and origin participated in this experiment. Her story also reminds us how art history is written and how so many are forgotten. To some, throwing new light on Rambure may seem a deliberately biased, revisionist endeavor. But it is worth noting that while few artists have been subjected to the close scrutiny that the Impressionists have both endured and enjoyed since the close of the 19th century, their women have received inconsistent attention. Although a self-proclaimed group of independents, the Impressionists were not radical in their gender representation. In fact, they were only marginally better than the conventional art world. Men outnumbered women in 1874, 76, 77, 79, 80, 81, 82, and 86, roughly 9-1. At the Salon in 1880, it was 12-1. To be sure, there were simply fewer women artists, and of that number, those willing to risk precarious reputations and already unstable careers to join a ridiculed faction were no doubt even fewer. The women who did participate, however, have not fared as well as the likes of a Monet or Degas or even Renoir. Indeed, the treatment of women in academic scholarship illustrates how a figure like Jacques François could be so easily and entirely elided from Impressionist lore. More often than not, they have come to decorate niches or occupy neatly labeled boxes. Mary Cassatt, painter of women and maternity. Marie Bracquemond, wife of fellow Impressionist Felix. Eva Gonzalez, somewhat erroneously adopted into the circle as she never participated in any of the 8 shows. Student of Edouard Manet, himself the never Impressionist. And most recently, Berthe Morisot, simply woman Impressionist. Certainly, these artists experienced a different world because of their gender. Access to artistic education, models, subjects, and platforms to exhibit were all more fraught. But overwhelmingly, it is through the lens of gender only that the discussion of their work begins and ends, if the conversation happens at all. It's no mystery as to why this is the case. Of the studies dedicated to Impressionism, serious attention has been reserved overwhelmingly for the artists whose works are most easily viewed, dissected, and interpreted. These artists are mostly men. They've far outnumbered their female counterparts. In turn, their collective output was substantially greater. And this large body of work increased the odds of their painting being circulated, exhibited, bought by collectors, and bequeathed to public collections. The systems that perpetuate known male artists have been a subject of scrutiny for decades. One of the preeminent art historians of the last academic generation, Linda Nochlin, spoke directly to this phenomenon 50 years ago in her seminal essay, "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" In a similar vein, the work of sociologists like Howard Becker in the 1980s demonstrated that cooperative participation from multiple corners of the art world was crucial to an artist's position in the canon, shorthand for the pantheon supported by the market, academia, and institutions, and that bears too on public opinion. There are, for instance, a few simple factors that placed and continue to keep Impressionist women's oeuvres at the margins. For example, the works of Cassatt, Gonzalez, and Morisot were largely kept in private hands during the painters' lifetimes, and following their respective deaths, they remained so. They were not widely sold by well-connected champions like the famous dealers Durand-Ruel or Vollard, or at blockbuster auctions. This coincided precisely with the period that Impressionist art was being most collected. The unintentional ripple effect is that it prevented or made difficult the study of all Impressionists' art among specialists, dulled early on the marketability of their art, and halted its dissemination around the world. Nor, for that matter, does this problem affect women only. Think back to that chart with the many other Impressionists you've never heard of. Two other Impressionists I've mentioned in this discussion, for example, are not artists that people would immediately recognize as figures associated with this group: Armand Guillaumin and Jean-Louis Forain, just to name two. This, despite the fact that both participated in over half of the exhibitions and that their painting fits squarely within what we imagine as Impressionist. While these precedents are slow to change and tricky to fix, the Marquise de Rambures presents an interesting opportunity to figure out how to tackle a larger system that excludes still so many artists. Rambures was actually a part of this group. She was producing painting. She was also writing about class and was a keen commentator on her world and the politics of her time. No, her modernism was not spent en plein air, painting haystacks, Haussmannian streets, or apples. Rather, it was one fundamentally shaped by other sides of modernity and by prolonged meditations on the societies through which she moved, as well as her place in them. This is the origin of her originality, that which, quote, consists in the manner in which one is impressed upon by the outside world, as she wrote in her diaries at the end of her life. It surely has a place within the circle, given her peers' often incongruous, sometimes irreconcilable aesthetic ambitions to capture impressions of the modern world that eventually managed to coalesce into Impressionism. They aren't marginal. Let's not continue to overlook her. Gracias.